Hello Crazyhouse chess fans, it's GM Max here, and for this video I'm going to show you a really cool game recently played by the strongest Crazyhouse player in the world, Catask, also playing against another FM, also anonymous FM 264brocc. And I really like this game because it shows us how to get an attack with the Grunfeld up as black, which is the one that most of the top players in Crazyhouse tend to go for, with white in turn playing a London system. Now, normally when I played London, it was usually with some knight c3 and playing the knight more actively. In this game, white decides to postpone the development of the knight and go bishop e2, castles. And I know h6 is a very standard one for black sub in these positions, where rather than sort of going after the bishop and not really causing a dent in the white position, instead black just make sure there's never going to be any drop on like a pawn on h6 or potentially a knight on h6 that could cause some real grievance for the black king. And actually, it's interesting white's next move, because I don't really agree with this particular choice that white played. If I was in white's shoes, I'd probably play a move like knight to c3, and just have ideas of putting the knight on e5, to which black might respond with knight e4 himself. And in this way, he's trying to basically have knight trades, so that after takes and takes, we can have extra space around the king, potentially drop something on h3, and try to play on the light squares. Whereas white in turn may try to play on the dark squares, but we can really see here the value in, well, the fact that we played h6, because if we didn't, the move pawn at knight h6, and then sort of taking on f7 and dropping a pawn h6 could then be very, very annoying for black, but here it's managed to be avoided. And in general, black scores pretty well in these positions, so even though I think white is probably not worse, I do think black practically has the easier play at this point. So admittedly, white's step is not the most aggressive. I mean, I guess you could play moves like knight bd2, but it doesn't really change all that much. But the move c4 is one I think is quite a common mistake played by normal chess players when they start in Crazyhouse. Because when you push the c-pawn like this, you are giving the opponent a pawn in the hand. And actually the move dc4 played by Catask actually improves on the move knight c6 that I had played in the game back when I was playing Crazyhouse myself before I decided to stop. But dc4 is a much better move. I think when I played knight c6 it was kind of a pre-move, just like, okay, I'm sure he's not going to play, like, got to play knight c3, and then he didn't. But in this position, obviously, it helps a lot that black has a pawn in hand. You can see the bar here to see the piece that the players have in hand. So where would you drop the pawn if you were black in this position? So there's a point where you might like to pause the video if you want to try and improve your own Crazyhouse skills. Otherwise, let's continue on, and we will see what Catask came up with. So basically, the key point is that it is this kind of system where when black is playing a dark squared strategy, well, in the d4, d5 lines, he's generally going to be playing on the light squares. And of course, the initiative is very important in Crazyhouse. So the move h3, putting the pawn is very thematic and a very standard idea. And we see that after g8-3 and bishop h3, that the black bishop is now very actively placed. And already I think this position is quite tough for white. In fact, the best option may well be to play a move like knight bd2 and actually sack the exchange. Because one thing in Crazyhouse you might notice, and I know it also happens quite a bit in 4-player chess, is my current preference of why I like to play. Well, in many cases, actually, the rook is not so much weaker than the bishop, at least early in the game. Because, let's say, if you did take on f1, well, then the queen or the bishop kind of takes the place of the defense. And meanwhile, that bishop can be very powerful to attack on the light squares or even to attack on the dark squares. Whereas if you drop the rook, I mean, if you put it on g4, it doesn't really do that much in reality. So, black best wouldn't be to take, but to play a move like knight h5 and focus on trying to get more material in hand. Because exchanges obviously favour the side who has the initiative and who is attacking, because they can drop the piece on the board faster. I guess a move like knight c6 or even pawn at g2 can also be considered. There's definitely a lot of possibilities for black. You know, probably knight to c6 is what I would do if I was black here, just to kind of keep the options open and see what white does as well. Because often if you give white a lot more choice, they're also more likely to make a mistake. Anyway, the game saw pawn at g2, which even though it's the most natural move on the board and probably one that most people would play, you're actually kind of happy as black to sack on g2. And this is a very thematic idea in Crazyhouse. Whether you're sacking with a knight, like from knight h4 takes g2, or sacking a bishop. The thematic reply is that often you can put a pawn on g4 in these positions, and then put a pawn on f3 after that. It is worth keeping in mind that this is a bullet game, so of course the quality of the game will not be absolutely perfect, and that's something we should keep in mind, that we should be somewhat forgiving of any mistakes that were played. I mean, for me to move knight pawn at g4 would be very natural, but and putting the pawn on f3 from there. You know, one key tactical point is that if you do put the pawn on f3, that, you know, white would love to get rid of that pawn in this way and not have to live with it for the rest of the game. The problem is that if you take, if you play queen f3, you run into a knight h4 fork. And it's the kind of fork I remember winning so many games in Crazyhouse where they didn't see this idea just with the whole take g2, g4, f3, and then knight h4 forks. You'll win a lot of games just with this one idea, I think. The best move actually turns out to be to move knight h5, which is not the most obvious move, but it's a recommendation of Stockfish with the idea of basically taking the bishop and going for this. I'm not sure if I actually agree with Stockfish necessarily, because white might be able to play something like bishop h6, and then he might have some potential to try to drop something. But I guess pawn at g5 doesn't really do that much in reality. You're probably dropping a pawn at g4 can be very good in reply. Again, going for this gf3 and knight at h4 trick. Keeping in mind, of course, that we do get the knight in hand when we take their knight in Crazyhouse. So, in any case, the move knight c6 was played by Catask. It's kind of a natural move, again, keeping the options open, like keeping him guessing if are we going to put the pawn on g4 or are we going to put it on e4 or do something completely different. Well, I played a move king g1, which is actually a very decent prophylaxis at this point, so that the pawn on f3 won't come with a check. Black put the pawn on g4. Again, pawn e4 was also possible. And now I played a move knight e1, and actually, to be fair, I think that white has defended quite reasonably considering it's a bullet game, but still his position ends up being very difficult. And probably in retrospect, knight e1 might not be the best move at this point. I mean, the best move may well be to... I mean, I was considering giving the pawn piece back, actually, with putting a pawn at g2, but it feels like that's just very... If you have to play such a move, it's kind of clear that your position has gone quite wrong at this point. But it might be the best chance to mitigate the damage. Because, I mean, if you're able to... let's say, put a pawn on g5 or e5 or get some play on the light square, then you could try to make a fight of it. But I do think that after g4 that this is going to be very unpleasant, where black's typical way of playing again is to basically sack, just kind of open up the position and, pawn at f3. Kind of shows a big disadvantage of the bishop being on f4, that gf3, knight h3 is going to pick up the bishop and give black a winning attack. But if you don't play this, black's going to take on g2, let's say knight e5 takes, and then black just drops a pawn on h3, knight at h3, queen takes h d4, and then pawn at g2 mate is one way the game will probably finish from here, unless white resigns or just gives up a whole lot of material, neither of which are really appealing options to say the least. In any case, after 91, we can start to see what makes Crazyhouse such a tactical game. Like, you can see all the different pieces sort of dropping on and off. For those who are familiar with the game of shogi, you might notice the similarity where sort of pieces often can like be dropped on the board, or when they advance to a certain point, they transform into other pieces. It kind of has that similar, very dynamic component to shogi with Crazyhouse. And it can almost get called like cousins in that sense. So now Catask realized that the queen on d1 is undefended, and he realized he can exploit that with the move pawn to e5. You could play the move pawn at e5, but I guess he wanted to keep the pawn in hand. So after bishop g3, ed4, it's at a point where even though technically white is up a piece, in reality the position is just winning for black, because the king safety is very important in Crazyhouse, and white doesn't really have a great way to defend his king. Now the move pawn on e5 was, I think, a good defensive attempt, but black has a lot of good moves in reply. Actually, to me, if I was black, I'd be very tempted by a move like pawn at f3, because even though you're sacrificing another knight, you again get the option to drop pawns on g2 or even on e2 potentially, and that way you kind of either win a rook, which just gives you a material advantage, or if they do take the knight, you can kind of just recycle more pieces, and basically you're going to have mate one way or another by exchanging pieces until, you have mating material, whereas white is just purely defending, and the black king, as you can see, is perfectly safe when you build this g8, king g8, bishop g7, pawns h6, g6, f7. It's very hard for white to get through this kind of setup, especially when black is also attacking. But black played d3, and I mean, it's also in the right spirit. It makes sense that when you are exchanging, when you have the attack and the initiative, that you want to exchange pieces, and often, if you don't much save king, train queens may just win you the game. I think in this position, white's best chance might actually be to sack the queen with ef6 and fg7 and try to get some counterplay, though I don't think it would have saved the game either. Instead, white went bishop at d3, and after ef2, bishop f2. I mean, black could play knight e5, but maybe Catask was expecting rook takes f2, and so knight 12 was a pre-move against that. That would be my explanation, because I think that here, I mean, pawn at f6 would kind of give white better chances. Granted, black is probably still easily winning after knight takes, and again, the main factor is that the black king is just so safe. White has 6 pawns in, black has 6 pawns in hand. We can imagine dropping like pawn at f3, pawn at g2. And then black is going to get the material in hand in order to continue the attack. Whereas white's not really in a position where he can really, well, turn his piece in hand into an actual attack. on the black king, because the black king is just way too safe here. As for the move queen g4 that was played in the game, well, black played knight takes e5, and we kind of see that, well, white is just way too open. And after queen g2 to move pawn at g4 was a nice controlling move, just preparing to drop a pawn on f3 or even h3, which is going to leave the white queen completely dominated. White tried to stop that with pawn at e2, but then the danger came the other way with pawn at h3. And after queen takes b2, g2, well, if black gets that rook, I mean, pawn at g2, rook h1 is basically a mating concept. So white play knight g2 takes. And after queen g2, knight f4, finally 264brocc resigned here. Because obviously if black takes the queen, he's just way up in material. But if you try to defend the queen with a move like queen e4, the simplest for black is just to play some move like, let's say, knight to f3 actually turns out to be forced mate here. I mean, obviously giving up the queen and allowing the queen on g2 for mate is not really ideal. But if you play ef3, then black has the move knight at h3. And then we have this nice mating pattern with the knights with pawn at g2 mate. So that's ultimately why white resigned here. I think you'll agree this is a very instructive game where, of course, it's true that catask being the top player in the world does make it look very easy. Because you can see 264brocc is a 2500 rated player, which I think puts him around the top 30 or so in the world. So certainly it shows a difference in class, but also it can be a very inspirational example where we can try to play like catask ourselves and then potentially, win a lot more Crazyhouse games by copying the ideas of the greatest players. So with that being said, well, I hope that you really enjoyed this video, and if you learned something and just had a good time, well, do make sure to like this video, and also consider subscribing if you're new to the channel, so that you can stay up to date with more of my chess content. With that being said, good luck in your next Crazyhouse games, and I will see you in the next chess video, dear Crazyhouse fans.